Welcome to Health Industry Hub. I'm your host, Rozalina, and joining me today is medical oncologist Dr. Huren Sivaraj, who is the co-founder and CEO of Oncoshot, a health insights exchange platform that has the potential to become a game changer within the clinical trials ecosystem. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rozalina.
A global reputation for clinical trials excellence has made Australia a go-to destination for many companies who want to conduct clinical trials here. But of course, like other countries, Australia needs to really think about how it can compete within this space by overcoming particular barriers that exist in the current clinical trials ecosystem, Huren. So from your perspective, what are the areas that you think are priorities within this clinical trials environment? And also, which key challenges is Oncoshot aiming to address?
Thanks, Rozalina. So I think Australia has been well established as a center of excellence or a country of excellence for clinical trials. Historically, as a result of having a strong regulatory framework, a lot of top leading researchers in the country, so there's a lot of knowledge base that industry partners can look towards in Australia, and at least a regulatory process that has been established. However, this is now, with a lot of globalization and knowledge sharing, it has become the set amount of minimum expectations for industry today in the larger environment globally. A lot of new developing countries are coming up with the same capabilities now. They are in essence leveling up. So it becomes really important for Australia to really look at what is the evolution that's required over the next several years to really improve its clinical trials ecosystem beyond what it's been doing. And this is where I think it boils down to certain aspects of improving the efficiency and access of its clinical trial or the clinical research programs. Now, part of that solution will come towards moving towards building the appropriate infrastructure, leveraging technology, and utilizing data insights to move towards, the next leap, also if I could call it, in clinical research. I think that is one of the big key areas which Australia needs to focus on so that it doesn't compete in the same space that everyone is doing. And it has to look towards innovating in that research space. And that's exactly where Oncoshot wants to drive its own capabilities and to support the Australian ecosystem with.
And as you said, it's incredibly important to differentiate Australia as a destination for clinical trials as other countries kind of step up to, take a piece of the pie within the global system. Interestingly, Huren, on the 18th of July, so very recently, Oncoshot entered a collaboration agreement with Omico, which is the Australian Genomic Medicine Centre. Now, this is a first of its kind collaboration, so very exciting, and a potential reference model for data sharing between private and public healthcare stakeholders. What was the reason or driving factors in being involved with Omico? And also, how is this relevant to the broader private-public partnerships in Australia?
So I think if you take a few steps back and look at healthcare systems and data, we have a much bigger fundamental problem globally. This is not just an issue in Australia. And that is the fact that healthcare systems and industry partners are really operating in very, very different and separate data silos. Now, to really make a leap in improving healthcare and outcomes for patients, and in this case, particularly cancer patients, there is a big and important role for us to be able to facilitate some sort of information sharing between these two groups of stakeholders. Now, the problem comes in with the fact that a lot of approaches or thought behind how do we share information has always been thought from the perspective of let's share all information. It's almost as if it's the all or none kind of scenario. And that has obviously not been possible because every healthcare system is very protective of its patient data for good reason. And there needs to be an exploration of where the opportunities are for which we can improve our data sharing. But at the same time, whenever there's data sharing that's happening, it can be done within a safe and secure framework. And that process or the end result of that data sharing can result in good outcomes for our cancer patients. Now, if you put that in the back of your mind as the larger context or where we need to work towards, I think cancer clinical trials and research lends itself into a very, very elegant and important use case where we can kind of architect data sharing in the context of improving outcomes for patients by sharing cancer data from cancer hospitals with the industry that makes these innovative drugs. In the larger global picture, there are more than 17,000 clinical trials or interventional clinical trials for cancer happening at any one point in time. And more than 30% of all the research efforts by global pharma and CROs is really on cancer alone as a umbrella entity. Now, in cancer, the dimension of care has evolved. It's no longer about treating patients with just a breast cancer or a lung cancer or a colon cancer. It's about understanding the molecular features of their cancers, being able to map out whether there are existing therapies that are defined by the molecular features of the cancer. If there are no existing therapies, there might be a whole host of developmental therapies that could also be tested against some of these molecular features. And this is the dimension of precision medicine or precision oncology that we are talking about, which makes up for a majority of the new and innovative clinical trials that's happening globally today. Now, one of the reasons why Omico is such an important partner for Oncoshot in working in Australia is the fact that Omico is in the process of providing cancer genomic testing for the wider Australian patient population, and at the same time taking advantage of that cancer genomic data to inform and guide the drug development process from start to end. And because that is their overarching goal as an organization, now Oncoshot with its technology and architecture can come in and say, hey, let us allow us to build that bridge where we can safely and securely share some of those genomic insights. And so that pharma or CROs which are developing precision medicine drugs or studies can actually explore the opportunity of bringing these clinical trials for the Australian cancer patient population via Omico's dataset. And that is the reason why Omico is actually quite a unique partner. It has high quality information that addresses an unmet need for our industry partners. And it's an important reference model for Oncoshot to show that with partners like Omico as well as hospitals, we can actually drive value for the larger ecosystem as well.
I think it's an excellent example of private and public partnerships, and I think we're seeing more and more of that within the healthcare ecosystem generally since in the last couple of years since COVID-19 pandemic. Huren, industry-sponsored clinical trials, you've already touched a little bit on that, but they spend $1.4 billion a year in Australia on clinical trials. So, of course, it would be incredibly important for these industry partners to choose the right, sites and other resources when they are thinking about where they would like to do the clinical trials, including other things that come, as factors in choosing these sites would be cost per patient, trial startup time, and also the capability of each site to be able to recruit patients in an efficient manner. So when you think about this, what do you think would be the motivators and the incentives for pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in really considering the Oncoshot solution?
So I think, when we understand the problem of clinical trials, one of the biggest gaps or needs for industry today is really how do we do clinical trials a lot more efficiently. Today, more than 80 to 85% of cancer clinical trials globally do not meet their enrollment timelines. So they set targets about when they can start these studies, but they almost always do not meet those targets. Now, a fundamental reason behind that is that if you look at how clinical trials are being planned right at the start, it is not actually leveraging on actual data of patient populations who exist either within a country or within those hospitals that are going to conduct trials in. Today, the legacy model of planning for clinical trials involves a feasibility questionnaire from an industry partner to an investigator in a hospital, where they ask the question of, do you have a patient cohort which may be suitable for that study? What is your estimate of those patient populations? And how long do you think you would take to find you or completely enroll those patients into the study? And it is almost always never based on actual data about the patients who exist. And the reason for that is because a lot of hospitals are using electronic medical record systems, but they don't have the ability to derive the appropriate insights from those electronic medical record systems. These EMRs have evolved from just as basically data capture tools and not as analytical tools. Now, what Oncoshot is trying to do is to address this inefficiency problem by being able to provide real-time matching insights from the point where the clinical trial is being planned. So even before the trial comes to a country, can an industry sponsor look at all the participants across multiple countries, decide where are the appropriate partners with this patient population, and subsequently when the study is then started, for the hospital to leverage on the same insights that Oncoshot provides to go back to the patients, invite them for the clinical trial, through a process of informed consent, eventually get them into the clinical trial. And by this manner, we are really trying to leverage Oncoshot's real-time data and insights to solve the problems from feasibility to screening and enrollment, thereby reducing the risk and the costs that industry accrues from its historical model.
Very interesting. And at the end of the day, and yourself being a medical oncologist, of course, all of this is about patients, Huren. And when you think about these efficiencies, what it means is you've got innovative therapies that will come into the market much earlier if you've got trials that are being done in an efficient manner from a global perspective. So it's incredibly important to consider. Now, Oncoshot is not only working within Australia, but it's also collaborating within Singapore and, of course, India as well. So from your perspective, what does the clinical trials ecosystem look like in these countries? Because it's no doubt a bit different to Australia. And how is Oncoshot contributing?
So I think the clinical trials ecosystem in the two countries are fairly different. Singapore may be somewhat similar to Australia. It's a much smaller population with fewer hospitals, but I think in terms of framework, infrastructure, and global pharma presence, it is fairly similar. The other dimension by which Singapore and Australia are quite similar is in terms of data, right? In Singapore, all hospitals are capturing data in electronic medical records. Across both countries, obviously, they are not completely ready to have data in a very structured manner ready for analytics. And that's where we are working with our data partners in both countries to help them to clean up their data and to plug it into an Oncoshot system. In India, it's actually quite different, where Oncoshot sees India as a major opportunity to bring innovative big pharma clinical trials into India. I think there have been regulatory differences within the Indian landscape for the last decade, but these have, kind of progressed over the last 3 to 4 years as well. And I think what is happening in India is a swelling interest amongst some of the bigger public and private cancer hospitals to actually do two things. The first being to embark on their own digital transformation journey, which they may not have particularly taken to over the last several years. And now they recognize that the data has to be digitized, and it's not just about digitalization of the data, it's also about analytics over that data. Now, that in parallel with the fact that they want to bring new innovative clinical trials to their cancer research ecosystem, I think that's where the opportunity lies for Oncoshot to be really the glue within that Indian ecosystem over the next several years. And I think we see a massive opportunity to be that data connector and that bridge across all the stakeholders in India over the coming years. Australia still remains a really big market. And what we would like to do is to make sure that we work at the level of not just hospitals, but also the networks or the consortiums that exist within the Australian research ecosystem, and also go beyond the boundaries of state to really bring value to Australia as a whole, and to provide almost like a gateway where pharma and biotech, which may be based, for example, in the United States and Europe, that may not have actively thought about Australia as their markets, can now use Oncoshot to proactively reach out to Australian stakeholders for clinical research opportunities.
It's incredible because it gives companies, organizations who want to do clinical trials this snapshot of what the potential is for patients. You know, as you said, whether they're based in Europe or the US, they can then be able to see what is the potential for us to be able to do the clinical trial in Australia when looking at all the sites that are part of the ecosystem with Oncoshot. So it's incredible.
And I think, Rozalina, one thing that I would like to add to that as well is that there's something very unique in our system. That data that we present, it's at two levels. The first level is at aggregate data level across a country. And that is one of the information that we initially provide that creates interest from pharma to engage the stakeholders. But the second part, which is equally important, is that data for every trial site or research organization is still controlled and managed by that stakeholder. It is not shared by Oncoshot. And I think this is absolutely important because it is an important requirement for hospitals to be able to transparently, visibly see who is looking at their data and what is the benefit that we're getting from data sharing. So in that sense, I think it's really important that we are bringing this value proposition to meet the very stringent requirements of our public sector partners as well.
Because data privacy is incredibly important within the healthcare system overall, and there's more and more pressure on the system to do the right thing for patients as we look at, you know, predictive technologies and other digital health opportunities to enhance patient care. So incredibly important from Oncoshot's perspective and for the private public partnerships also. My last question for you, Huren. As a medical oncologist and obviously as the co-founder and CEO of Oncoshot, what are you excited about when you think about the future of clinical trials and also the opportunities Oncoshot has to enhance patient care?
So, you know, when I started my journey with Oncoshot, there was an eventual vision of how my clinical care would also evolve into. And I imagine that with the ability for data to flow in real time, to be able to process and to provide the appropriate analytics, which is really how does a patient match into a clinical trial and how does a clinical trial find matching patients within a hospital. I envision that as an oncologist on a day-to-day basis, for every patient sitting in front of me, I will be able to pull out not just their medical records, but continuously that landscape and visibility of clinical trial options that they would have. Not just limited to my domain of knowledge or expertise or awareness at that point in time of what's happening in my center, but really, you know, in a holistic, clear manner, all those options. Patients should be able to see their standard available therapies and the clinical trial options that were equally relevant for them. And every oncologist would have the opportunity to discuss those developmental therapy options at every time point in the treatment journey. Now, I think we are at the very early stages of that, where we're really focused on the enterprise organizational level value proposition, but I think that's where we want to be over the coming years, and that's where I believe patient outcomes will be truly impacted, and hopefully one day we can see cancer as more of a chronic disease. It's already becoming that for several conditions within cancer, but I think hopefully a much larger number of patients will benefit in that manner as well.
It's an exciting time for the future within oncology and for all clinical trials when you think about what is possible in providing a more, as you said, more comprehensive care for patients as a medical oncologist within the sector, and also as a clinician within other areas of healthcare as well. Huren, it's such a pleasure to have you on Health Industry Up. Thanks again for joining me today.
Thank you, Rozalina. It's a pleasure to be here.